This sermon was preached at Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope it encourages you and challenges you.
Everything you hear about Portland is true. And I'm glad to be here this morning. So thank you for the invitation. I was the pastor at Park Lane Christian Reformed Church in East Portland for 27 years before I retired. Bruce, where are you? Okay. Bruce was present at the first interview I sustained back in Michigan when I was still going to seminary. And then as I served that church for many years, I retired about 7 years ago, and I've been doing interim pastorates ever since. I was in Montana, San Jose, Yakima, Phoenix, hottest summer on record in Phoenix until this summer. And most recently, I've been serving our church in Tualatin, Oregon, just a little bit south of Portland. So it is my great pleasure to be here today and to lead us in a time of worship that focuses on God's Word. So the book of Philippians, so the sign out in front of the church is not telling the truth this morning. This is not an expositional sermon from Luke. It is an expositional sermon from Philippians. Philippians chapter 1, starting at verse 12, reading through the first half, or most of verse 18. Let us hear the reading of God's holy word. Now, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Well, as I said, we're here in Philippians this morning. And perhaps it's worth noting, just in passing, that in 2019, just before the pandemic, my wife and I were able to visit the ancient ruins at Philippi, located in what is now Greece. We were on a tour called In the Footsteps of St. Paul, part of an 18-day package. And during that time, we visited most of the cities that Paul went to on his missionary journeys, Ephesus, Berea, Corinth, Athens, Thessaloniki, etc. To me, Philippi was one of the most attractive places we stopped at. The ruins are nestled in a valley surrounded by impressively high mountains, a place where lots of Roman military officials retired back in the day, and they must have enjoyed it. Part of our tour was to go down to the river where Paul and Silas went when they first came to the city on a Sabbath morning. You can read about that in Acts 16. We were there on a Sunday. Our tour group stopped for a short worship service. It was summer, a hot day like today, but by the water there were trees and lots of shade. I got asked to preach a brief message to the 40 or so people with us. That was a neat experience for me, literally in the footsteps of St. Paul. Now, it was in the nature of Paul's ministry that he would move from place to place. So he's writing to the congregation at Philippi, one that in the human sense grew up because of his efforts. And he's doing so because they want to know what in the world has happened to him. Lacking internet or even the U.S. Postal Service, they have reached out the best way they know how by sending one of their leaders, a man named Epaphroditus, to visit him in prison. Now, the letter doesn't say exactly where Paul was at the time, only that he was, as we say, in detention. there's a good chance that he was in the great city of Rome. For Epaphroditus, that meant a journey across open water plus a considerable hike using the vast system of Roman roads, about 700 miles. You don't go far unless you really care, especially back then. So our text this morning is Paul's answer to the Philippians, "What in the world has happened to you?" question. And I suppose we might wonder if his reply is relevant to us nowadays. Time moves on, right? And yet we should remember that the Bible and everything in it is our story. And our story is important. For example, last time I visited my grandchildren who live back in the state of Virginia, I took them to the site of the Battle of Yorktown, about an hour from their house. Do you remember what happened at Yorktown in 1781? Oh, I'm getting some blank looks here. Okay. This is where George Washington's Continental Army finally and completely defeated the British, thereby ending the Revolutionary War. And I took my grandkids there because I thought they needed to see where the independence of their country became an accomplished fact. Put it this way, if we don't know our story, if we don't take its lessons to heart, we are less able to tell the difference between wisdom and folly. And to my mind, the story of Paul and Philippi matters even more than the story of Washington and Yorktown. Thus, our journey into Philippians this morning, I believe, will be worth the effort. This is our story. So let's look at the text, starting at verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, there's a big story behind those few words. Paul's in prison, and you might say that really it's his fault. This all started in the year 57 AD. That will be on the exam at the end of the sermon, 57 AD, keep it in mind. At that time, he was going all around Greece and Turkey, okay, visiting churches. In the process, he was collecting an offering for the church at Jerusalem, which was experiencing hard times. Nothing wrong with that, right? But then he insisted that he was the one who should take the offering there. And that's when the trouble started, because he was a notorious figure in the holy city. He had been a deeply conservative Jewish scholar, one who tried to root out the Christian faith when it first appeared. But then in a shocking turnabout, he had gone over to the other side and become a Jesus worshiper. As a result, there were many in Jerusalem who viewed him as a traitor and truly wanted him dead. Now, the people in the churches Paul was visiting knew he would be in danger if he went to Jerusalem. They said, "You should let someone else move that money. Don't go in that hornet's nest. They'll kill you." But he felt it was important to go, in part to try and mend a rift that was developing between Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and Gentile believers in the hinterlands where he did his work. So he went anyway. And then when he got there, he was seized at the temple by a Jewish mob and nearly got torn limb from limb. You can read about that in Acts 21. The Roman authorities took him into custody, partly to protect him from his foes. But after that, his only opportunity for freedom and for safety lay in appealing to Roman justice, the Roman justice system. So he made the appeal, but then that meant, this is getting kind of long, isn't it? That meant that he had to be taken to Rome, where he had now been in prison awaiting trial for almost as long as I've been talking about this. Actually, for 2 whole years. You thought American justice was slow, but bureaucracy everywhere and always acts pretty much the same. So, the Philippians are concerned to know what's going on. Are you alive? Are you in good health? Is there anything we can do for you? And Paul knows this has been a circus. He knows things haven't worked out the way he hoped. Yet in spite of the jail time, in spite of what some view as his foolishness in going to Jerusalem in the first place, he comes out right away and says, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, there are two big things in this text I would like us to note. Just two sort of meta observations. The first is that Paul says almost nothing about his own personal circumstances, choosing instead to talk about how the gospel's doing. Of course, Epaphroditus will have all kinds of personal information once he gets back to Philippi. Yes, Paul is well. No, he's not discouraged, etc. But in the letter, the apostle carefully chooses to focus on the advancement of God's kingdom, the good news that the new age has dawned through the death and resurrection of Christ. And it's not that his personal situation is unimportant to him. It's that he and the good news are so tied together, so intertwined, that he can't explain himself without making reference to that overarching gospel reality. As he goes on to say, as a result of my imprisonment, he doesn't say I'm terribly discouraged. As a result of my imprisonment, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers here have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. Now, one way to look at this is to say that Paul is kind of whacked out. Okay? Man, he's taken that religion thing a little bit too far. But it's like I said, just as the gospel is our story, it is obviously his story too. It's the one he lives in, the one he thinks of himself as acting out. I have a role here that I have to play. I am on stage acting it out before my Lord and King, and there is no way I climb down from here till he says my performance is complete. And boy, we could use a few more people like that. My story and God's story are so intertwined, I can't separate the one from the other. So that's one large observation. And the other is in verses 15 through 18. For some reason, Paul has run up in Rome against at least a few people who have it in for him, and I mean people in the church. In verse 17, he speaks of those who are stirring up trouble for me. But he's not so interested in how that is affecting him either. Indeed, he has taken that trouble and placed it under God's care. To him, it's okay if people put him down. It's okay if he is wronged or disregarded. Some of these folks are preachers who apparently want to promote themselves in addition to proclaiming good news. They are building their brand, as people say nowadays. But Paul doesn't particularly care because these folks, though they are ambitious, are still Christ-centered in their proclamation. So as the text says, what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. One writer puts it this way. He says, this is the primary theological freight we should move from the passage into our lives. If we face life-threatening circumstances, or if people treat us cruelly, we should keep in mind Paul's perspective. What matters most is whether or not the gospel's going forward. If it is, then we should rejoice. Now again, that sounds kind of whacked out, right? Well, a little bit too religious there. It sounds like we're avoiding what would seem to be the main thing, which is what happens to us personally, right? Okay? But to repeat, the gospel is our story. And most of all, it is God's story. That makes it the true story. And as a result, every other story must subject itself to this one. including your story and mine, the one about where we live and what we eat and how our kids are doing and whether the world's falling apart all around us. Oh God, everything's going to hell. What are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is double down on God's story, take it all the way till the wheels fall off and burn, which is how Paul chooses to deal with his frustrating and no doubt depressing circumstances. Now, as I thought about this passage and prayed over it, struggled with it, it seemed to me there were three things we could say about how it applies to us personally. I think these go together logically. The first is that, like Paul, we should be concerned for the advance of the gospel, so much so that it becomes our joy, something that makes us happy. That's the last word in the passage, you know. Paul talks about how Christ is preached, how the whole palace guard has learned about his Christian stance. Then he says, because of this I rejoice. It's a key concept in Philippians. Joy in its various forms comes up 16 times in its 4 chapters. But then to put that joy at the front of our minds is harder than it sounds. There's too much going on after all, right? Too much difficulty, too much worry. You know how it is in life. We figure we'll get to the really important stuff once we get our problems solved. When my marriage is settled, when I have enough money, when my anxiety settles down, then I'll be ready to put first things first. But I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I ever will be. So I flounder in the meantime. And that is serious stuff. Life is serious. But let me make a serious suggestion, practical suggestion. You know, one of the ways we deal with difficulty is by distracting ourselves, right? For example, I distract myself sometimes, true confession here, by listening to sports radio talk shows. Am I the only one? Oh, I saw it. I see somebody back there. You know, Dan Patrick, Colin Cowherd. This is a useless activity wherein I listen to supposedly informed people talk about the many travails of the Portland Trailblazers, or the fortunes of the Green Bay Packers, or whether or not such and such a player will be traded to some team, and for whom. Dumb as it sounds, I'm interested in this stuff. I can sit and listen to it all through breakfast, and I forget about all my problems when I do. It's great. Probably do it tomorrow morning. But here's my suggestion. Distract yourself with the news and progress of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Make that your hobby. I mean, you may be into home decorating or hunting or working on cars or traveling to distant places. Those are great distractions. But why not make the progress of the gospel a chief interest? You'll have to listen to some podcasts, probably, or maybe read a book or two. Find yourself a good preacher online who really makes you think. You'll have to learn to pray about stuff. Maybe you'll decide to go to a conference or a meeting that scratches a particular itch. If you're going to travel, perhaps you should go to Israel. If you do, it will blow your mind. I promise. Get interested in your story. Learn about it. Talk about it with others. Be curious. Ask Pastor Brad if you don't know where to start. He will tell you. Because you need God's story. You're the next thing to naked without it. All it takes is one bad event or one defining disaster, and you'll realize you have nothing. No resources to help you face what's in front of you. And it's not just for disasters that you need God's story. It is for the right now. It is for the ordinary. And of course, it is true that a half-hour sermon at church once a week will not be enough to feed your soul. It is a start. But you know, there's a whole lot of experts out there who are doing everything they can to distract you from God's story so that you will buy more stuff or work yourself up into a state where you're like a bomb that's ready to explode. depending on which person you listen to on the radio. You need to make your story, your real story, your main hobby, thing I like to talk about, read about, listen about. So that's one thing. Then the second practical application has to do with Paul's difficult circumstances. We're going to run into them too, right? Maybe you're in the midst of them this morning. But let me tell you a great Bible truth that nobody wants to believe, which is that God sometimes takes us into adverse circumstances. Please note what I said. It's not just that He would find us and then deliver us from adversity. We're in a roadblock, but God provides a way out. Rather, He leads us into and through difficulty, directs that we will need to plow that hard soil. That's what's happening to Paul in the text. We don't like this idea, but I believe it to be true. It doesn't happen all the time in our lives, but sometimes it does. And we can survive those hard circumstances by viewing them through a gospel lens, which is saying a lot. The terrible story of Job, hopeless as it sounds, helps us see how this is so. Job, you may recall, loses all his wealth and all his children in a single day. Down he goes with no way to get back up. It is like he's been shot in the heart. A big part of him dies that day. But a small part refuses to wink out. Job 1, verse 20, says that afterwards he tears his clothes and shaves his head. He didn't have real sharp razors back in those days. It must have taken a while. It's a way to show his agony. But then afterwards he falls to the ground and of all things worships. Naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now his wife's response is to say, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. It's pretty funny, actually. A great many people have done that when life goes terribly bad. Many times it seems like the most reasonable response. But Job understands, maybe it's the only thing he understands in that moment, that to give up on God is to give up on the only means by which his story can ever make any sense. Because again, trouble will come to us. It's Job who said, man is born to trouble, and surely as sparks fly upward. Job 5:7. Now, when it happens, we can say, as many unfortunate people have, that life is nothing but an empty cosmic joke. All the crap I've been through proves it. Or we can say with Job, blessed be the name of the Lord. Because there's no doubt God is in the midst of Job's life. In the story, we learn, even though he never does, that God has actually allowed this to happen to him for reasons that are never explained and which we cannot fathom. And like Job, we can experience the same thing. A lot of times we don't know what's happening or why. For example, my wife does not know why she has had cancer twice in the past year. Why, for example, she had to undergo 8 hours of surgery a year ago today and 4 months of recovery afterwards. I don't understand it either. But we're not giving up on God's story. It's our story, and by His grace, we're sticking to it. And then my third application, I think, flows naturally and biblically from the first two. I have to cheat a little bit to get there. I want to do so by reflecting for a moment on Philippians 2, verse 5, which is just one page over in the Bible. This is where our text is headed, actually. The verse says, very simply, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. You see, Jesus dealt with constant adversity. As Isaiah 53 reminds us, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Now that sounds really depressing. Almost like Jesus was saying, hey, let's see how bad life can hurt. But the point is not how much hurt can he handle. The point is why he's willing to put up with it. And why is that? Why is he willing to put up with it? It's because he means to save the world through his sacrificial love. He means to save the world through his sacrificial love. His goal is so important and his love is so great that if he must sacrifice and if he must suffer, he will. But he does not exclude us from his sufferings. In a highly significant passage in Mark 8, he tells his disciples for the first time that he means to go to the cross and die. But the very next thing he says, and this is crucial, is that if we mean to be his followers, we too must take up our cross. If any man would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross. Mark 8:34. Now, that is a weird statement in one sense. I mean, we cannot take up our cross the same way Jesus did, right? He died for the sins of the world, and we can't do that. But there is a larger category here, which is that it was sacrificial love that led him to the cross. Sacrificial love that kept him plowing that hard ground there in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he died. Father, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done. Mark 14:36. And my point is that the way we know we understand God's story, the way we know we really get it, is when we're willing to practice sacrificial love. This is a constant theme in the New Testament. Read and see, it's all over the place. It's like what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:14, the love of Christ compels us. It makes us do things we would not otherwise do. Jesus wrote our story. He wrote the story of sacrificial love when he died on the cross, but the story is still not done till we take up our cross and follow him. Maybe you've heard that Greek, the language of the New Testament, has a special word for this kind of love, agape, the kind of love that gives itself up for the other person, which is what Paul did. I'll go to Jerusalem and try to solve a church dispute despite the danger. It's what Epaphroditus did. I'll go 700 miles to see how my friend is doing. It's the acid test for whether we really believe our story. Does the love of Christ compel us? So, be concerned for the advance of the gospel. Know that difficult circumstances will come, and decide that you will take up your cross of sacrificial love, because that's how our story works, and we're sticking to it.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.